Hello, today we are joined by Melissa Mbugua. She is an innovator, creative producer, entrepreneur, and is the co-founder of Africa Podfest and works at the Radio Workshop. I'm going to let Melissa introduce yourself and tell us more about your work.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. My name is Melissa Mbugua. I'm a Kenyan based in Nairobi, with an eye to, I get very excited about doing, connecting people around the world, in Africa and around the world. And so Africa Podfest is a platform that was started about 5 years ago to connect African podcasters as well as Africans in the diaspora and the people the stakeholders who are interested in the future of audio. And the idea behind it was connect people so that we can collectively learn, we can collectively share resources, and that we can collectively build out the foundations of what will become an inclusive audio industry on the continent.
Mm-hmm. And just, Melissa, what tapped you or attracted you to the auditory arts world? How did you get there in the first place?
Yeah, yeah. So my background is in tech, in the tech world. And so I worked a lot in the technology innovation space, supporting entrepreneurs, managing funds for specifically civic technology startups. But I've always had a keen interest in the arts. I was very curious about like media and where media would go in this future digital world. And I'm, like many Africans, I guess, I've grown up loving radio and, with radio being a part of daily life. But I also noticed that the older I was getting, the less and less mainstream radio was serving my needs. I just wasn't hearing what I wanted to hear on radio, but I was seeing content online, like on social media and blogs, that I was interested in. So, for example, just stuff about like African history, or just hearing perspectives from across the continent, from people who are also young, and people like me, or even who are not like me, but who have something to say. And so the more I sort of thought about that, and the more I started to ask people about it, it just snowballed. The curiosity snowballed such that I then carried out this survey in 2017. I did this survey, just, a very informal kind of I did it, on the side in my after hours. I did this survey of just to look for any Kenyan who had a podcast at the time. And I got like 6 or 7 responses. And these were the early podcasters. So asked them a few questions around like their process and what advantages and disadvantages there are that they were facing. Asked them about their audiences, asked them why they were doing this. And the responses were so interesting that I ended up hosting a meetup, a very, informal, semi-formal meetup over lunch. And that's what validated for me that, there's something here. There's potential. This is just, at the time, there were only 6 who responded, but they were so engaged. Their results, the results they were seeing from their work convinced me that there was a future in podcasting, and that we just needed to plug the gaps. And the gaps were, of course, a network to collaborate, access to resources, and more kind of knowledge and training opportunities to build on their skills and so on. And so that's what seeded the idea for Africa Podfest. Something else that happened, actually, so I published the findings on my blog, and the reach of that article went further than, it blew up in a way that I just didn't imagine. So I ended up fielding like media interviews from like Johannesburg, so many places around the world. And I realized, so it's not just a Kenya thing. This is an Africa-wide, phenomenon that's bubbling under, and it's still in its very early days. And so I, kind of put the idea together and pitched it to a couple of my friends. They thought it was interesting as well because they also had media backgrounds. And so we started Africa Podfest.
Mm-hmm. And if you go back to basics, what is a podcast? If you're to explain to somebody, what exactly is a podcast?
A podcast is, strictly speaking, by the way, podcasts are audio. So the definition nowadays is evolving into video, but if you were to ask me, strictly speaking, a podcast is an audio file that's online that can be accessed, that can be streamed or downloaded. So it's basically, yeah, that's the definition. It has to be on the internet for it to be for it to be considered a podcast. And so, but then, the definition, again, nothing is cast in stone as yet, because you could have, for example, a TV show or a radio show that you broadcast, but then you also get a copy of it and then you upload it on the internet, and it's the same TV show then becomes a podcast because you've uploaded it online and called it a podcast. So it's also, I guess, that's the beauty of it, but also a challenge is that a podcast is what you make it, really, in terms of can it be video, can it be audio? Yes, you can have a video podcast, you can have an audio podcast. How podcasting started, like the roots of podcasting are, strictly speaking, audio.
And with your work, you speak, and you were talking of beauty of podcasts. For you, what exactly is the beauty of this type of media?
For me, the beauty of it, and I'm speaking again from an audio perspective because I'm I'm an audiophile, is that it is one, it's accessible. It's accessible to people in terms of cost, because as long as you have a smartphone that can record, then you can make a podcast. As long as you have a smartphone and you have an internet connection and you know how to use, these apps, then you can make a podcast. So it's as accessible as that. Second, by nature, inherently, by definition, a podcast is very it's about a two-way communication between you and your audience, which is similar to radio as well. It's just that with podcasts, because they're online, you then have multiple ways to communicate with your audience. You have social media, comment sections, so it's by definition very much a community building medium. It's very centered on community. And thirdly, because of the format of podcasting being so open and flexible, and not kind of, let me say, standardized, you can have all sorts, you can have a 2-hour long kind of format that's fiction and maybe theater, or you can have a monologue style that's 15 minutes long, or you can have narrated podcast that's a documentary. You can have an interview style. There's so many formats, and audiences are so willing to kind of consume, because I think the way we've come to understand podcasts, people don't have any set sort of they're not fixed that, oh, you have to have this current affairs podcast in the style of news, for example. You can have it in any style and people will still be open to it. So it's flexible. There's a lot of autonomy and independence. It's accessible. Yeah, and as of now, it's because it's nascent. There's this freedom to experiment, for people who are into experimentation and who are not afraid to sort of take risks. Podcasts are great right now because it's still new.
And it's interesting how, with the work that you're doing in Africa Podfest, started with an event, and then evolved now to research and creating also spaces for this community. With your second now, or the first Africa Podfest report, which is the mic on, which I like the name. You're looking at trends. So what was the key thing that came out from that first work?
That first work. The first key insight there was that most podcasters and also most audiences identified as female, which then validated that the reason why podcasts are taking off is because of audiences who feel underrepresented in the media. So women, queer people people with disabilities, communities that just feel are and have been historically underrepresented in media are the ones who are taking up this fresh, new, independent, autonomous medium. And secondly is that the thematic interests are majority, issues to do with like culture, mental health, wellness, themes that are the opposite of what mainstream media prioritizes. But mainstream media prioritizes like news, sports, I think politics. So it literally is like the podcasting showed us that, where traditional media is headed is the opposite direction of what audiences want, at least young audiences, mostly women, but also there are a lot of men as well, lots of male identifying audiences. So that just told us, the future is quite different from what the past has been. And that's interesting. And so that's worth investing in further, because young people are saying this is what we want. And also it tracks with how traditional media, at least in Kenya, they're faltering, they're struggling a lot with their sustainability. And I think it's because of that, because they're not where the audiences now currently are.
And with your second report now coming in 2022, it was more of the mapping and looking at the growth and sustainability. With the first one at understanding the landscape and the second one looking at the growth, what were the key insights that came from that work?
So in terms of, one key one is that because it's new and young, it's changing quite rapidly, right? So if we were to do a survey now to map trends, we'd need to go with an open mind, because it's probably quite different from what we found in 2021. We don't know, right? Because the number of podcasts has increased, things have changed so much, and it's evolving rapidly. That's one. But secondly, there are already quite a few podcasting outfits, if I may call it that, so new media ventures who have found a way to sort of pull together resources, put their skill sets and their knowledge base together, and have developed models, very clear business models. They have shows that have succeeded to various degrees in Kenya, across the continent. They know how to grow audiences. They know what their audiences need. They basically have their business plans in order, and they know where the direction they need to go. And they know exactly what the barriers are and how to navigate around them. And one of the, let me list for you actually what we found the barriers are to growth in podcasting. Not different from many of the barriers that we typically hear that hinder economic growth, which is one, just access to infrastructure. Second, like consistent power, like electricity supply. Just the usual kind of issues that we know affect barriers to economic growth in Africa. So infrastructure, energy, and of course, access to capital, access to financing and business support, as well as, what was the other one? Oh yeah, the fact that specifically for podcasting, because the business world or the stakeholder community is not yet quite knowledgeable on this medium and on digital media in general. And so there's that barrier of, you have to then also do the work of creating awareness when you're in this business. So those are the challenges that people are facing. But in terms of audience growth, where they're able to get to with what they have, the audience is just growing. The curve is just on the rise in terms of audience numbers. So for most of them, what they're betting on is just staying in the game, however they can manage, because the numbers are growing. And then as they find ways to work around and overcome those barriers.
And you're talking of lack of infrastructure. In this case, what will infrastructure look like?
Right, yeah. Infrastructure looks like equipment. So I said earlier, you can start a podcast as long as you have a phone and an internet connection. That's true. But then if you're going to produce consistent consistently and at a level of quality that's high, then you need, good mics, good, you need a mic, you need mics, not even a mic, but you need good mics, you need, professional level software, you need a studio that's well soundproofed, professional setup, you need a team, professional sound designers, producers, writers, researchers, the full sort of production team. And you also need as part of your team, you need a business sort of unit as well, like somebody to figure out partnerships and revenue streams. So but infrastructure, sorry, that now I moved on to capacity, but infrastructure means equipment and studio space mainly, as well as, software, and your computers, your tools that you need to be on the internet. Yeah.
And also in your work, in this study, you talked about the regulatory framework. So what is that? What is the current situation within that space? Because we're talking of internet space, we're talking of, are there boundaries within this when you look at podcasting?
Yeah. In Kenya, because we have quite a progressive, we have quite progressive policies around universal internet access, e-commerce. We even have like an e-commerce policy. So on the policy side, at least when it comes to digital media, on the policy side, there's space for growth. The policy is matching sort of where we're headed as an industry. But on the flip side, and this is the historical issue that continues to be a big barrier, is how, media tends to be very tightly controlled and operating in quite a limited environment from a political perspective, because media is still viewed as mainly a threat to political establishment, right? And freedom of expression is something that's considered by, in the political space as something to be stifled. And so podcasts fall very much in that category. So it's risky. And those are some of the limitations that I think, will face podcasters going forward. But as it stands, also another challenge is that while it's clear that podcasts are a digital medium, from a commercial perspective, I guess the way the policies stand is they can see that, we can regulate these podcasts as businesses that are operating online. But in terms of being able to really have their teeth regulation, to be able to say, you can't say this, or how they're going to hold podcasters accountable for what they say, what they broadcast, that's still very vague, because in as much as, the Communications Authority, there's a framework for holding, let's say, a news legacy media house that broadcasts, or a radio station that broadcasts that's licensed, that has a Communications Authority license. So there's a framework to hold them to account. There isn't such a framework for podcasts. So there's still it's still quite vague there. And that can be, there's an upside to that because you can push boundaries, but it's also a downside because how do you hold podcasters accountable for like journalistic ethical standards? Because anybody can pick up their mic and broadcast anything, even though it's, it would be hateful, it would be inciting violence, it would be very negative and have negative impacts. There is no way to hold podcasters to account. Beyond sort of the current legal framework that there is, but it's not very clear around how podcasters would be dealt with.
And also within the research, with the themes that podcasts were covering, science and technology was 6.5, with culture and arts and media taking the top with 31.5. With the world we live in, and you look at the topics or the challenges or the innovations within the health, climate change, mental health. What do you think is the potential of civic science engagement within Science Podcast?
Yeah, I think that it's quite high because the podcasts that do the best, even in terms of financial sustainability, are the ones that are niche. In terms of audience growth, financial sustainability are the niche ones. So because it's very clear who they're talking to and their audience needs is very clear about what value this show is giving them, you know? And so one thing that we've seen is that the more supply there is in podcasts of a particular theme, then the more the audience grows in that that responds to that particular theme. So we are far from reaching the saturation point. We don't know yet how far, for example, the science and tech theme will go, because as yet, I think there's still a lot of room for science and technology podcasts emerge and kind of meet the needs of the audience that's hungry for that kind of content. That said, I think that something I've observed since we published that research between last year and this year, especially around the Africa Climate Summit, there's been quite a spike in just interest and by at least from the environment side, in people just wanting to understand climate change, and so ordinary people who are outside the scientific community. And so I think storytelling by scientists or from the scientific community that manages to convert or to convey to audiences in a way that they would understand in an everyday sense what's going on from a science perspective, even with health, because of like COVID, people just wanting to understand what, even the word pandemic was so new to our, everyday lingo. But I feel like there's a lot more curiosity from the general public. And so there's room in our minds for more science shows. Yeah.
And one of the recommendations for the report was language innovations. This is an interesting topic because with our last series, we were focusing on language. So just give us an insight within that topic or issue.
Yes. See, well, young people are the majority, right? Audience, and most young people are not in the cities. They're not mostly in Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu. They're more, distributed in peri-urban or in even rural areas. Let me say smaller towns, let me say that, yeah, because where the internet access has existed for a longer time and where the young people are kind of clustered together. And so and social media and internet culture has taken root. So these young people, because of, again, just that need for media to represent the people who it's for, most people just speak the language that they prefer to consume media that's in the language of their everyday life. And so I think the trend there just reflects, right now it's still, the percentage of podcasts that are in local language, that's actually, even most podcasts are in English, let me just say that. But then again, that's because most podcasts currently come from like Nairobi. But more and more we are seeing as the uptake of podcasts spreads, we're starting to see more and more non-English podcasts coming up. And I think that will be the future, even when you look at, for example, like TikTok, where non-English TikTok, local language TikTok is just taking off. I think podcasting will follow that trend. And it's only a question of sort of awareness and uptake outside of this big cluster of Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu.
And you also put in a rule of the game, whereby you're talking of off-peak, on-peak. Maybe you could give us a brief on what that is.
Yeah. So classically in podcasting and radio, especially before the pandemic, podcast listening, audiences listen to podcasts mostly during the commute in the morning and in the evening. So those are the peak times. But the pandemic has completely disrupted all of that. And now people are just consuming podcasts based on their schedules. But still, generally speaking, broadly speaking, most people listen in the evenings and in the mornings, which also correlates with social media, and at some point in the afternoon, which correlates as well with social media spikes. Usually morning, middle of the day, and then evening. I guess that's when people are taking breaks, or when they're starting their day, and in the evening, kind of when they're winding up. And with podcasts, people consume them while they're doing other things. So for example, household chores, or driving, or on their commute, or exercising, because it's a companion, it's audio. So it's a companion activity to something else. So weekends, so that's the rules of the game have also evolved just with how the pace of life has evolved, as we are becoming more and more facilitated by online tools.
I think also from what you're talking about with your work from 2017 to now is that it's such a dynamic field. Yes. Keeps on changing. What we know now might be so different in maybe even 2 years or one.
Yes.
And because our audiences are interested within the civic science space and science engagement, for someone who wants to start a podcast in science, what particularly will be your 2-3 recommendations or tips?
One, I would say figure your audience, because if you have this idea for a podcast, I imagine that it's because you've sensed an opportunity or a gap somewhere where you have something to say and there's an audience that will receive it, whether it's an audience of fellow people in the science space or maybe outside of the science space. So if you can just become very, very clear on what this story is that you're telling, or another way to put it is, why are you telling this story? What is the story? And for whom? If you can answer sort of those 3 questions, then you have a show. You can get going, because as long as you have an audience, then you can have a podcast, and it'll just grow from, even if your first episode will have 10 listeners, just keep going. Consistency is what makes successful podcasts. The more you're out there and the more consistently you publish, over time, your audience will grow. And if your audience, you don't have to compare yourself. Don't worry. So this is the other thing. Don't worry about comparing yourself to sort of these podcasts that have millions of downloads, because they're more, maybe they're thematically, they're more general audience. Set your expectations and your goals on the basis of the how do I say, the nature of sort of the stories you're telling. So, and by this I mean, if your topic or your subject matter is super, super niche, then if you have 5,000 listeners who are regular, because maybe there are 5,000 people who will understand this topic, then you're winning. And you can sustain yourself from that. Yeah. So avoid that pitfall of thinking, oh, but I have to have 1 million. You don't necessarily have to have 1 million if you're niche and you know exactly what the purpose of your show is. And that's why I said, start with what are you talking about? Why are you doing this? And to whom? That'll help you clarify and even set your goals and manage your own expectations clearly. The other thing is, you don't have to have a perennially running show. For example, it could be a limited series, because if you know your why, then maybe you just want to tell this particular story and 10 episodes will do it, and that's that. And then you just find and you move on. So it could also be a project, a campaign level podcast. It could be a show that you want to run, kind of like a radio show for many years, or it could be somewhere in between. Yeah. So again, this goes back to the flexibility of the podcast space. Yeah.
It can be project based. Like the
Yes.
longevity of it varies. So
Exactly.
okay. Thank you so much, Melissa. Really appreciate it. This has been like a back to basic session and very insightful about the podcasting industry within the continent. And until next time.
Thank you so much for having me.